Hello and welcome to this webinar focused on securing the enterprise amidst constant change. I'm Dustin Grimmeissen, AHEAD's Senior Director of the Technical Specialist Organization. In today's presentation, I'm going to talk about the key challenges that cybersecurity professionals face and also the threat landscape, what the most common threat vectors look like, and the most common tactics, techniques, and procedures that attackers are using to attack the enterprise. Well, I'd like to start by just giving a high-level foundation to AHEAD's approach to enterprise security. And really, we boil it down to taking a more proactive and pragmatic approach to enterprise security. We feel that ticking the box for compliance, as an example, is not helping secure the enterprise. We really want to look at the key challenges that we face, focus on the crown jewels, and also focus on the most critical threats that we face and keeping ourselves up to date on those. So let's start with the six challenges, the six key challenges as we've identified them. The number one challenge that everyone faces these days is ransomware. We continue to have this conversation on a daily basis. How are we able to be protected against ransomware? How are we able to detect when we're being hit or when some of our data is being hit? And more importantly, these days, we're hearing a lot about if it happens, or more importantly, when it happens, is starting to become the accepted, the accepted thing. When it happens, can we recover? So ransomware is the number one challenge that we all face right now. If we look at the landscape of threats expanding on us, another challenge is that we have to admit that adoption of public cloud is no longer an option. And public cloud is not just infrastructure as a service in one of the big cloud providers, but it's also SaaS and web-facing applications that we really just can't get around. Everyone has them in some way, shape, or form, and most people have multiple clouds. So traditional perimeter-based security options, they don't quite work the same as they used to, and we have to take into account the adoption of public cloud and that applications can live in any cloud. And really the third challenge piggybacks off of that. We have what I like to call the new way to work. And really the new way to work to me is any application anywhere, any user anywhere. So, we talk about public cloud and SaaS and really data and applications that can live anywhere, but now the user can be anywhere. This was a trend that was already happening pre-COVID, but COVID, of course, accelerated the trend where now workers can be at home, they could be at a coffee shop, of course, they could still be in the corporate office, but you can no longer trust that the network they're on is the perimeter to their security because they and the data are traveling everywhere and provides a complication to building enterprise security programs. Number 4 is a general shortage of people and skills in the cybersecurity space. We have read some reports that talk about how in cybersecurity there's a negative unemployment rate, meaning there are more job openings than there are people qualified to fill them. So this obviously presents a challenge to enterprises to building security programs if they're unable to get the talent to help build those programs and help mature them and help be better at staying on top of the latest threat landscape. And what a lot of enterprises fall back on is compliance. And what we found is way too many companies that are compliant but still fail pen tests, or they're compliant but they're still getting breached. And compliance programs are important in the context of being able to focus on the important things in an industry or the important things to a business. But just ticking the box to compliance doesn't mean that you're necessarily targeting the crown jewels to your enterprise and the most common threat vectors that you might face. So we continue to see a focus on what I call ticking the box versus actually being secure. And really what that boils down to is challenge number 6, which is there's really no direction and no prioritization to the efforts that enterprises are facing in a lot of cases. And this really compounds with the other 5 issues. But if you're not looking at the new way to work or the new way that applications are delivered or what the most common threat landscapes look like, it's very hard to build a security program that is mature, that is on top of the technology, and is integrated and embedded in that technology. So what we recommend is prioritization and action, not waiting for perfection, but looking at those challenges that you face and looking at the threat landscape and acting on them, and acting on the threats that are the most important at this time. And what we've done is we have boiled down the tactics and techniques and procedures, TTPs, to the top 7 that appear in over 99% of data breaches. Now, on the screen here, I have the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. There are other good reports out there. IBM also has a cost of data breach study. But what these reports do is they go over the major breaches that happened in the last year, and they talk about the damages that were done, the costs of those breaches. These are the kind of reports where you get the mean time to detect and the mean time to recover type statistics. But they also talk about the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are used. And what we found is that these 7 that I have on the screen right here are present in over 99% of data breaches. Now, most cases it's multiple of them, but these 7 appear in over 99% of the cases. So if you really want to be proactive and pragmatic in your approach to enterprise security, rather than looking at the holistic compliance framework that you're working against, we recommend focusing on these 7 things and really maturing your program around these 7 things. If we look at the TTPs themselves, the first 2 are really the ways in, right? Email phishing continues to be the number 1 attack vector. It's nearly impossible to prevent users from, all users, especially many of them being non-technical, from clicking a bad link. The number 2 way in is exploiting a vulnerable application or device that are exposed out to the internet. And so if you look at those 2 things together, you really look at the 2 most common ways in. 3, 4, and 5 are sort of resulting, are what happens to make these attacks worse, right? They're either going to install some type of command and control, take over a device in the environment. They're going to capture credentials. And in the worst case scenario, if they steal credentials of an account that has high privileges or administration type capabilities, that's when these attacks go from bad to worse. Lateral movement, meaning land and expand. This is one of the reasons why it takes a long time to detect a breach, is because usually when an attacker comes in, they're not going to necessarily execute the large-scale ransomware or whatever it is they're trying to do right away. They're going to see how they can move laterally through the environment before they unleash the full attack. TTPs number 6 and 7 are really resulting actions. Either the attacker has access to data that they shouldn't, or they're stealing it, or most common these days, they're just encrypting it, destroying it, and looking for money for you to get access back to it. So if you look at the 6 challenges, and then you combine that with the top 7 TTPs that present themselves in the breaches, you can really have a pragmatic approach to solving this challenge. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm really going to focus on just one of the 6 key challenges, ransomware. It's the top threat that we all face. And honestly, it not only is it one of the TTPs, or resulting action in and of itself, but all 7 of those top TTPs are generally executed when there's a ransomware type situation. So to show our approach to building an enterprise security program, ransomware makes sense as a good challenge to zoom in on. And so if I look at our approach to ransomware holistically, we have kind of a 3-pillared approach to how we approach it. One is, of course, start with the top 7 TTPs. Assess and develop a ransomware strategy that measures against those TTPs. They're the most common things that happen in a data breach, and ransomware is the most common outcome of a data breach. So it makes sense to build your ransomware strategy around that. From a mitigation perspective, we build architectures around zero trust, and I'll get into a lot more details on what zero trust means to us, because we feel that it needs to be defined. There's a lot of different vendors and industry organizations that have defined zero trust, but we have a very simplistic definition that I think makes sense in the context of having a proactive, pragmatic approach to cybersecurity. The last piece that sometimes gets forgotten is plan for data recovery build cyber recovery solutions that realize that the things that you need to do to recover from a cyber incident are different from your traditional data protection and disaster recovery type scenarios. And so it requires a new look at data protection and recovery specific to cyber recovery. And, as we'll get into when we get into more of the details, in a ransomware situation, the scariest thing that can happen is that there's no way to recover. That's when those ransoms are starting to get paid, is everything else failed from strategy to zero trust architecture, and there's no way to recover. And we'll talk about how to prevent that in environments. But let's first focus on the ransomware strategy and measuring against the top 7 TTPs. And this is our approach to how to quickly get a ransomware strategy that covers the most common attack surface. Now, of course, we start with the NIST CSF like many of our customers do. And, we look at the 5 functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, and how they align specifically to ransomware. What we're going to do across these 5 functions is we're going to measure using an ISO standard of level 0 to 4 on how mature a security process is. Too many things in compliance are about do you have it or not have it. Really, you need to look at the maturity of implementation and where you want to get in these particular areas. Every organization is going to be different. But at a simple level, it's either controls are not implemented, they are implemented, they have some process and documentation around them, and really the highest maturity is you start to optimize the processes or you start to add automation into the process. And what we do when we combine those things together is we'll do a defense in depth assessment that looks at the 7 TTPs that appear in 99% of the cases, and we'll measure them against identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, and we'll measure maturity of that process and give you something like the diagram on the screen here that allows you to see at a high level, where you're more mature, where you're less mature, and where different focus needs to be paid. And this just helps with that proactive approach, right? In this particular example, this client scored very highly across the board in recoverability, but had very low maturity when it came to credential capture. And so in this particular case, it might be that we need to focus on an identity and access management type program to help mature in this scenario. But every company is going to come out differently when this assessment is done and across the different 7 TTPs. But what we're going to do if we're the ones helping you build your ransomware strategy is we're going to assess across those 7 TTPs, and we're going to provide that outcome that shows maturity across those and aligns to the NIST CSF. But we're also going to develop an action plan that says, go do these things to reach the next maturity levels that make sense for your organization. And I have one slide on here that kind of shows that in a more detailed way. Now, on this slide, there's a bunch of logos. Think of these as just examples. I'm not here to talk specifically about products, but on the right side, that just gives you an example of some of the solutions, the vendor solutions that are helping across the 7 TTPs, but really focus in on the middle layer. Let's just take one of the 7 TTPs, vulnerable devices and applications, as an example. Now, many of our clients are doing some amount of vulnerability scanning and patching in their environments, but to become more mature, you need vulnerability management programs, and really the most maturity is where there's some automation built around not just the scanning, but the actual remediation. And there's also prioritization to the remediation. And so this is how we can show you moving along the maturity curve, not just products, but the overall program and the service that you're providing back. Using another example here on the list, lateral movement, one of the 7 TTPs. This is really where that zero trust conversation comes into play. And zero trust, as I'll get to here in a little bit, is a lot about identity, but also that sort of lateral movement on the network, that segmentation that we talk about. But this gives you an idea as you mature and as you reach the maturity level that makes the most sense for your business, some of the different solutions that you might implement along the way. So it gives a good idea of how taking the idea of that the top 7 TTPs are the biggest threats we should focus on, measure maturity against those things, and then what are the actionable outcomes that you need to take to mature along that curve. So that covers the ransomware strategy element of our process. Let's talk about that zero trust mitigation layer, if you will. Zero trust, in our mind, really boils down to these 3 principles. One is verify every user and device. Zero trust should be an identity-based methodology. I talked about earlier with the new way to work and cloud adoption that data can live anywhere, users can live anywhere. The traditional firewall perimeter isn't sufficient anymore when there's data moving all around in and out of that firewall and across multiple clouds. So really, identity becomes a much more important layer of security. Identity becomes the perimeter in the environment. And so if identity and access management is not something that's mature, well, to have a strong zero trust methodology requires identity and access management to be mature. And then sort of after doing that verification of who your users are, what your devices are, what they should have access to, then the middle layer is adopting what we call, or what the industry calls, least privileges. And to really boil that down it's the bare minimum access required to get work done. We see too many environments that have wide open permissions. And, what happens there is one of the TTPs being password theft or credential theft. If a particular user or a particular account gets compromised that has wide-scale access on the network, that's when the attack goes from bad to worse, right? That lateral movement occurs in the environment. One user getting attacked or one user clicking a bad link in a phishing email, credentials are stolen, and then they move laterally through the environment. So zero trust really needs to be focused on the identity of users and devices, but start to pare down the privileges to the bare minimum necessary so that if they are compromised, the damages are limited. And then the third piece that often gets lost in the zero trust conversation is that you have to do that continuously and intelligently. As you work towards least privileges, it's not an instant thing. You have to start wide and start to minimize over time. And you use inspection of log activities, behavioral modeling. You pay attention to the environment such that I like to use an example of, say there's a finance directory in the environment, and based on the group policy, that finance directory has 100 users who have access. But over the course of 6 months, your analytics shows that only 5 users ever access data in that folder. Well, adopting the idea of least privileges means there's 95 people that have access today that probably don't need it, right? So you intelligently limit that access and you continuously pare it back to only the required access to do work and sort of minimize that risk. If I take that out a step further to more solutions that we think about in zero trust, identity and access management, again, becomes the new perimeter. Things like single sign-on, things like multi-factor authentication so that you have that second factor when users are logging on, because it's not just knowing who your users are, but it's verifying them every time that they want to access systems. Privileged access management comes into play because the worst case scenario is some kind of a privileged account is compromised. And then segmentation of the network. Segmentation reduces that east-west exposure, that lateral movement on the network. So within a zero trust architecture, we also talk about network segmentation and micro-segmentation that needs to occur to intelligently limit access. And then finally, you need visibility, you need monitoring, you need automation in the environment that's continuously not only looking at the behavior and paring back that access, but looking at the threats as they hit and changing your zero trust posture based on that. Now, NIST has a standard, for zero trust architecture. I won't spend a lot of time talking about this in this presentation. I just want to show some of the different pieces and parts that come into play, from endpoint management systems to, of course, compliance frameworks to threat intelligence, right? How do you intelligently limit that access? You have to have intelligence from the devices and the users that are out there. And then, of course, on the policy enforcement point, you're going to enforce zero trust policies at the data, at the application, on a user-by-user basis, at the networks, as we talked about. And of course, you need a logging, you need a SOC, you need something that's helping you continuously monitor that to look for threats, but also to look for behavior that makes the most sense for your environment. So I gave my definition a bit ago, which was the bare minimum access necessary to do the job. The NIST definition is basically the same. It's any trusted, validated device granted just-in-time accesses for an authenticated user. And I think that's a really important point there. So talking about that authentication, if I haven't stressed it enough already, identity and access management becomes a really critical part of a zero trust architecture. But you have to start by identifying the business requirements, right? The users, the devices, the threats that, or the criticality of those users and devices. Identify all the assets and applications that are in scope, identify all the users that might consume those assets or applications, and then develop a process for authorizing and authenticating access, verifying that users and devices are who they are using multiple factors. And only then can we really start talking about IAM solutions, right? You really need to build a program that thinks about what that access should be for every different business, what the applications are that are required and what the users are that require access to them. And then you can start thinking about the solutions that make sense. But at a high level point, just want to point out that identity and access management is a big foundation for a zero trust architecture. And then that second layer around the network, this is a very complicated slide here, so not to go through this in great detail, but I think a couple things to point out that we've talked about already. One is, a lot of network segmentation traditionally is done by the perimeter firewall. Everything that sits behind the perimeter firewall in the data center or maybe in an office space is quote unquote protected. That's obviously not going to be the case anymore if more and more applications are going to public cloud or just being consumed as a SaaS service. So you have to start looking at things at multiple layers. There's zero trust applications, which can run in the cloud or in the data center. And that's where you start to think about that microsegmentation idea is how do we get beyond just sort of the north-south through the firewall, but minimizing the communication between applications to the bare minimum necessary to do their job, right? Just minimizing that threat landscape. Then, of course, you have zero trust at the workplace, things like network access controls. This is big in manufacturing and healthcare, where there's a lot of non-human devices that are on the network. What should they have access to talk to, and trying to pare that down to the bare minimum. There was a breach in the last year or so that famously was caused by a thermometer in a fish tank that was compromised. Well, if you're following a zero trust principle, there should never be a case where a thermometer or something like that getting breached could ever cause a wide-scale ransomware incident, but in this case it did. And then, of course, there's zero trust at the user layer, and that not only is identity and access management for the users, but the devices that the users are on. And so if you look at zero trust on the network in these sort of three areas, one of the things that we're starting to see is this consolidation to SASE, Secure Access Service Edge. And why this is happening is because, well, the users can be anywhere. The applications can live anywhere. The devices could potentially be on any network. And so the first iteration that we're starting to see is all of this traffic, remote users on a VPN or branch locations are hairpinning back through a perimeter firewall somewhere, usually in the data center. And you can apply security there, but you're also going to give up some aspects of performance, right? Some aspects of flexibility for the users. And, that perimeter firewall becomes a pretty critical thing, not just from a security perspective, but from a performance perspective. And so this move to SASE is sort of admitting that the users and the apps and the data can live anywhere. So really, our network, our perimeter network, needs to live anywhere with them. And SASE is really, I think, an easy way to think about it is it's taking the perimeter firewall and moving it to this unlimited scale perimeter firewall that lives in the cloud. And so your users, your apps, and your data can be anywhere, and your firewall needs to be anywhere. And each of the leading SASE vendors does things slightly different, but for the most part, they do the things that you would expect out of firewalls. They do inspection of traffic, IDS, IPS. They can do segmentation. They can do things like DDoS prevention. Some of the SASEs are starting to add elements that maybe weren't there in a traditional firewall, things like DLP and CASB, because if they're going to be out there and they're going to be the interface between users and clouds and data, that's a good place to enforce security policies around those things as well. And so what we're really moving towards here is a modern topology where I don't necessarily care where the users are. They could be remote, they could be at a campus branch, they could be inside the corporate office. I don't necessarily want to care where the applications and data are, whether they're in the data center or the cloud, or they're served up via a SaaS service. If I can integrate with my identity workflow and I understand who the users and devices are, and then I provide those network controls at this SASE layer or cloud delivered security layer, then I can start to get back to the same posture I had when everything was behind the same four walls, and sort of that perimeter is reestablished again out in the cloud. And so from a zero trust perspective, this is really the topology that we're moving towards, is a cloud delivered aspect and a very identity centric aspect of things. So zero trust is obviously very important in the ransomware discussion from that mitigation standpoint, how to prevent that lateral movement, how to prevent a small attack from becoming a big attack. The last piece that I'm going to talk about here is data recovery when it comes to ransomware. And before I do that, I kind of like to walk through some history of ransomware or history of malware. If you look back 10, 15, 20 years ago, most of the, malware that was out there was focusing on, localized data or end users. You start to get a little bit more wide scale when they're able to take out, say maybe multiple end user devices. Where things really started getting scary in the last 5-6 years is this third wave that started looking at the network and the attacks started to spread all across the network. So it wasn't just data that's on an end user device that was impacted. It could be data on a network storage device. It could be data all across the network. And this is when we started seeing companies having to pay the ransom because the damages were so widespread. The fourth wave is, in the last few years, the most common thing that's happening now is the backup systems themselves are being targeted. And so even if you have you have an attack that's widespread, you don't have a way to recover data. And I'll walk through this in a little bit more detail, but this is why data protection was always important in the context of ransomware recovery, but it's becoming now a critical piece, and it's why it's one of the three main pillars to our approach to ransomware, because we're starting to know that it's not a if, but a when scenario when enterprises are going to be hit. It's nearly impossible to stop every attack that comes in, but zero trust tries to mitigate the damages, and then cyber recovery is giving that way back, right? And so if I zoom in on a little bit more on why that's happening, ransomware targeting backups, just a couple of areas here. One is, your master server. If the backup catalog itself is destroyed, encrypted, whatnot, it doesn't matter if the data on the tape or the disk is good, because in most modern data protection systems, the master server or the backup catalog is what makes sense of all the data that lives out there on media servers or tape libraries and those kind of things. So, not only do you have disk libraries that could be themselves exposed to the network, they get encrypted, that's a bad scenario. Worst case scenario, obviously the entire backup catalog gets targeted. And this is usually going to be the last thing executed in a ransomware. That land and expand mentality. If the attacker's able to get to the data protection environment, that's when they know that they're going to really be able to make some widespread damages, because they know that this enterprise they're targeting does not have a way back. So let's roll back to the NIST CSF and, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. This framework has already thought about how data protection and data recovery are critical to a cybersecurity framework. We don't often think about data protection and recovery in the context of cybersecurity, but it's a huge component to cybersecurity. And specifically, when you look at cyber recovery, it's not just how do you back up your data, but do you have a path to recovery? And if I zoom in on that just a little bit, we like to talk about how disaster recovery is not cyber recovery. A lot of clients I talk to will say, well, I have a disaster recovery process. I have multiple copies of my data protection, but that serves a different purpose than recovering from a cyber incident. Disaster recovery is generally focused on some system being offline, right? A power outage, maybe a weather event. It's usually regional, and you're usually looking to get systems back online quickly in another location or in a secondary copy of the data. And so, it's really focused on systems being offline. In a cyber recovery situation, the systems might be up and running, but the data itself is destroyed. And that requires a totally different recovery mechanism. You may not necessarily need that instantaneous recovery that you have on your that you have on your disaster recovery plan. But you need to make sure that the cyber recovery information is isolated so that if the main backup environment is attacked, it can't get into the cyber recovery vault. You also need to look at, how you recover information, because in a cyber recovery incident, usually you're not just going to do one big global restore. You're going to restore important systems first and then sort of have a plan that's built into incident response. But a high level, cyber recovery is different than disaster recovery. And I think that's an important thing to take into account, that you have to do different things to account for cyber recovery. And, we like to talk about taking some important considerations into mind. When I was talking about identity and access management, I talked about, building that plan around the users and the applications and the devices of the environment, and what are the assets and who should have access. Well, the same thing happens when you talk about cyber recovery. You have to determine what that business critical data is. Building a cyber recovery vault for 100% of the environment is usually not necessary. What are the mission critical assets to the business in the worst case scenario of ransomware that you need to be able to get back? Build a cyber recovery plan around those things first. For the rest, the disaster recovery plan is probably sufficient. So determine that business critical data, assess the total volume of that data, right? How big does the environment need to be for cyber recovery? Determine what business recovery needs to look like in a cyber recovery scenario, and then align that to the rest of your resilience strategy. And think about this in the context of all the three prongs of our approach, assess against the TTPs, the mitigation layer being zero trust. Well, I also want to think about my cyber recovery in that aspect, in that not only am I trying to identify the business critical data, but if I've done zero trust well, in theory, if I do have to get back to recovery, I'm only recovering a small part because I didn't allow the damages to be widespread. So all these things really connect together between the strategy, the zero trust architecture, and cyber recovery. Taking a closer look at the cyber resilience here, we like to talk about having a good, better, best approach. Good is really just doing data protection best practices, maybe having a tertiary copy of some data, maybe having some network segmentation of the backup environment. The backup environment doesn't ride on the production network, and adding some amount of immutability to the data protection environment. Better is really where you take that immutability to the next step. A lot of our clients are really just starting here, which is, let's make sure that the backup environment itself is not encryptable. If the whole entire environment is encrypted, I at least want to have this vault where I can go back and get my mission critical data. And so a lot of focus is being put here to hardening of the backup systems itself. Now, if you take that a step further, keeping in mind the maturity layers that I talked about before, really the best starts to talk about automation and analytics and things that you can build around to make it even better. And so the best scenario in a cyber recovery is you start to think about physical isolation. So not only immutability where the backup data itself can't be encrypted, but maybe the tertiary copies in a physically isolated environment, not even on the production environment, except for the very short time it takes to back up the data. Then there's also this idea of using the data protection environment as the layer to do analytics. The data protection environment is generally going to be the thing that sees all the data and all the changes in an environment. So, outside of maybe the network, it's the best place to look for changes, to start to identify data breaches and encryption events before they get very widespread. And so as you look at this across a maturity curve, yes, you want to do best practices. You want to harden your data protection environment so they themselves aren't an avenue to attack. And then potentially you want to look at physical isolation of critical assets and using the data protection changes as a way to analyze the actual changes of data in the environment. And so that kind of rounds out our approach to ransomware. Build upon the 7 TTPs, build a mitigation architecture built on the philosophy of zero trust, as we've laid it out in this presentation, and then plan for data recovery in a cyber recovery scenario, not just disaster recovery scenario. So that concludes the main part of the webinar. I put up on the screen here kind of to bring it all back together, a proactive and pragmatic approach. Look at the key challenges that enterprise face today. Look at the top threat vectors, the TTPs as we've defined them, and build a security program that seeks to mature across these areas. Target the key challenges and target the key threats that we face. And with that, we'll wrap up the presentation. I appreciate the time spent today, and hopefully you learned a little bit about AHEAD's cybersecurity strategy, how we're tackling the threats faced by all of our enterprises today, and hopefully you got some tips on how to move forward in this environment.